The one thing I do remember from Shepton is the toilet in the governor's office. It was renowned. It apparently dated back to the Victorian times. It was a little toilet adjacent to the governor's office, which probably originally wasn't the governor's office. But this throne was magnificent. It was of carved wood and did everything. It didn't flush very well, but it looked beautiful. And interested in jail. I mean, the argument at the time always was between Shepton Mallet and Lancaster Prison. Lancaster's closed now, as of course is Shepton. Lancaster was originally a castle which had a prison attached to it, but was reputed to be, held the accolade of being the oldest one in the country. Shepton always argued that because it had been built as a jail somewhere in the 1600s, that it was actually older as a prison because it wasn't a dungeon attached to a castle, as it were. But fascinating old place in the sense that lots of narrow passages, lots of very small cells, damp, all the usual problems that you get with a fabric of a building that was originally built somewhere around the 1600s. Lots of additions, lots of later buildings added on, some during the wartime, some post-war, for various purposes. Some of them quite dark, but we won't go into that for the moment. So yeah, it was an interesting jail with lots of quirks. My understanding is that it was the design of the place is not unique, but very unusual. It was built originally, I think, as a kind of replica for a similar place that had been built in Switzerland, of all places. Now, why on earth it must have been some nobleman came back from whatever war and decided that it was good. From that point of view, it was good. I mean, being a sort of rectangular core with this courtyard in the middle allowed very secure areas for exercising prisoners. But of course, it was quite small and a little bit claustrophobic. Clearly, the numbers over the years were varied from time to time. I mean, I can't say much. I'm pretty old, but I'm not old enough to be able to say too much about the pre-war period. But my understanding is that during the war, for example, when the Americans had it, the population at one stage was up in the 7 or 8 hundreds. I mean, it was quite, which must have been immensely tight. When I ran it, it was, I think we were running at around 250, 60, that kind of number. But there was a lot of overcrowding at the time, and we ran on up to about 280. But certainly you felt it when you had that extra numbers. Now, when it was closed around 2013, I understand the numbers then had dropped to about 180, which was probably a more realistic and sensible number given modern times. Now, there was also a period, and again, I don't know when, but it would certainly be probably early 20th century or 19th century when there were some women kept there. But because in the old days, they weren't very particular about sorting out the prisoners. If you were a debtor or did something wrong, you went to prison. Period. There were a large number over the years of executions at Shepton. In fact, I suppose it may be unusual that it boasts two execution areas. I mean, the original one, as I understand it, was an integral part of the main prison um, on one of the sides of the square, so to speak. But when the Americans were there, they constructed a purpose built red brick building which served as an execution center where they used to hang prisoners in the same way that we used to hang them. And of course, we should all remember that it was only in 1966 or thereabouts that the abolition of capital punishment came about. I joined the prison service in 1964, and although for a while there had been no hangings anywhere, technically the death penalty was still on the books. So all the jails that had um, uh, drops and cells for this particular purpose, where I had to keep them open and keep them running because who knew what was going to happen. The British took it over, I think, about 39, end of 39, 40. It became a British glass house, as they used to call them in those days, which was the jail for prisoners, for squaddies and of all services. And in fact, all services, I think, at time to time were sent there. And then around sometime in the 40s, I guess, given that America joined the war in 41, so it's going to be 41, 42 time, the Americans took it over as a detention center. And gradually, and it became one of the key areas for them to house particularly difficult prisoners. And a number of American executions took place. As I say, they did build an execution thing there. I understand as well that at least two prisoners were actually executed by firing squad. And in fact, one of the little things we always used to look at on the internal wall, the inside of one of the outside walls of the jail, you can still see, or you could in my time, you could still see the pock marks of where the bullets had gone into the wall. Now, whether that was exactly the place, but it was reputed to be, that's where they used to do the shootings. But in terms of the American occupation, again, it's of some interest, perhaps, that the film The Dirty Dozen, although not filmed in Shepton, but there is some scenes at the beginning where he's putting together his Dirty Dozen, goes to a jail and talks to people. That is based on the the kind of thing that would happen, the kind of cells that there were at Shepton Mallet at the time. Yeah, I mean they were there under the British military, my understanding. They both had like all lads at that time. Post-war, I think this would have been. They were or just after the war, at the end of the war, they were doing national service, and rather than agree to doing national service, as it were, they both committed offences and got themselves incarcerated. Because once the Americans left at the end of the war, it then reverted back to the British military. And I don't think it was until, I'm not really sure, but I think about 66, the military handed it back to the civil authorities. And then it reverted back to being a civil jail again. The whole point of running a jail of that nature at the time, one of the reasons why I guess it's now closed, is it's a hell of a challenge because modern penal methods are totally different from those that prevailed when the jail was built in the 1600s or whenever it was built. And we've hopefully modernized our thinking and gone forward a bit. So to try and fit in modern jail craft, as it were, into that kind of setting creates all sorts of challenges. But nevertheless, we still had, I mean, I do recall whilst I was there were a couple of abscons, as they were called, where prisoners left outside parties. They're referred to as an abscon because they didn't actually escape from jail, they escaped from custody, but not jail. But we did have at least one, I can't remember many more, but we had one where I think a couple of guys managed to cut their way out of the cell windows, or chop their way. They didn't actually cut the windows. My recollection is they didn't cut the bars, but they chipped away the old masonry and managed to force the bars open. And of all things, they used knotted bed sheets to drop down onto a flat roof of one of these later editions of the building, and then managed to make their way out and over the wall and escape. They were recaptured, but that was a bit embarrassing. The other thing, which was, I guess, quite humorous, it didn't seem humorous at the time, but looking back, it was. We had the honour of having a hostage incident where a prisoner had been taken hostage by a couple of other prisoners in his cell. And as was the case then, I think it's all different now, but certainly in those days, this concept of hostage taking was still fairly new. And there was a special unit that used to turn up on site with all sorts of wonderful wizardry and special gizmos to try and help the commander of the incident, who in this case happened to be me. And so they went off to do their bits, came back and said, yeah, no problem, Governor. If you need sight into the establishment, into the cell, We can provide that within about a minute and a half. And if you really need to get in to intervene, if somebody's in desperate need, we can get you through that window. No problem. We get your lads in there within about 90 seconds. No problem. Okay, thanks very much. So we didn't obviously use it at that stage, but it was something to park and think about. And then within half an hour or so, they were back. Sorry, Governor, we gave you misleading information. Oh, what's that? Well, we hadn't realised how old the building was. We hadn't realised how it was built. The walls are so thick. In this case, the bars were so far set into the masonry that actually the force of explosion required to blow the window out would probably take most of the wall out as well, and most of the people in the vicinity. So we can't really offer you that option. So, which wasn't a great denial, but it was just amusing afterwards to think that we could have, had I gone down that road, it could have been quite a nasty incident. So it just demonstrates how with old buildings and old establishments, you have to be awfully careful about the way you go forward.